Okay, so this one is called The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought of a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick down to his workshop. There, he stuck on a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It happens so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was growing so gradually she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. That stick's too long for you, Mr. Twit said to her one day. Why, so it is, Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was. There's something wrong, all right, Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. What can have happened? Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. It must suddenly have grown longer. Don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow. Then what on earth has happened? Cried Mrs. Twit. It's not the stick, it's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. That's not true, said Mrs. Twit. You're shrinking, woman, said Mr. Twit. It's not possible. Oh, yes, it jolly well is, said Mr. Twit. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never, she cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk by comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. The dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel so terribly that she had to sit down. Okay, the next chapter is called Mrs. Twit Has the Shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, There you are. You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground. Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same with the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. Just look at you sitting there in your old chair, he cried. You've shrunk so much, your feet are dangling in the air. Mrs. Twit went white with fear. You've got the shrinks, cried Mr. Twit, pointing at her finger at her like a pistol. You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen. Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble, but Mr. Twit still remembered the worms in his spaghetti. He didn't feel sorry for her at all. I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks, he said. What? Gasped Mrs. Twit. What happens? Your head shrinks into your neck. Your neck shrinks into your body shrinks into your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. I can't bear it, cried Mrs. Twit. It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. The worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I end up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. But isn't there anything we can do? Cried Mrs. Twit. There's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit. Tell me, she cried. Oh, quickly tell me. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Mrs. Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. What is it I must do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. You have got to be stretched, said Mr. Twit. Right, there she is. Okay, this next chapter, Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string, and a gas cylinder for filling up the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring to the ground. Stand there, he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring, and when that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long piece of string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled up on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some under her wrists, and some even in her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. Can you feel them stretching you? Asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. They're stretching me like mad. He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloon. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? She gasped. If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me. And that was what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. There's enough pull here to take me to the moon, cried Mrs. Twit. To take you to the moon, exclaimed Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dearie me, no. We most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more strings around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe. Very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit, and with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. Help! She screamed. Save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. What a pretty sight, he said to himself. How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever. Oh my goodness, they are so horrible to each other, aren't they? But he's taken it too far now, hasn't he? We'll have to see what happens next. I'll see you on the next video.